My name is Lisa, a 35-year-old part-time worker, living with my husband, Mark, and our daughter, Emma. Mark is an office worker, and Emma is in the first grade. We purchased an old single-family home and still have an outstanding loan. When Emma entered elementary school, I started working part-time, and we've been paying off the mortgage together. Mark is the eldest son, but his younger sister, Nancy, married before us and somewhat forcibly settled in their parents' house, living with her father. My father-in-law seemed to be open to anyone taking over the house, but Nancy, who married first, drove out her brother, claiming the house was hers. "I'll take care of Dad, so I'll take the house." When Nancy got married and started living in her parents' house, her mother had already passed away, but her father was still in good health, so she didn't have to take care of him. The parents-in-law's house is a large one, and I remember being surprised when I visited it before getting married. It had a splendid gate and an expansive plot of land, which made me ask Mark, "Could it be that your parents are wealthy?" When we were dating, Mark didn't give the impression of being very wealthy, but seeing the grandeur of his parents' house was quite a shock. Mark denied it, but the interior of the house was also impressive, which surprised me even more. According to Mark, his grandfather was quite wealthy, but it seems the family fell on hard times during his father's generation, he explained, laughing. His parents' house, which was left by his grandfather, is only large but old and uncomfortable to live in, he says. Even if it's old, his parents' house, which is in a residential area and has such a large plot of land, can only be described as incredible. I somewhat understand why Nancy, who kicked out Mark to live in her parents' house, feels the way she does. She'd be happy to make this land and house her own. However, I don't know whether the property and the building's ownership have actually been transferred to Nancy. When Mark and I got married, he told me that since Nancy would take care of his father, I would never have to take care of my father-in-law in the future. We also intended to let Nancy, who would take care of her father, inherit the house, so we bought our current house. Even from my father-in-law's point of view, he would probably feel more at ease being taken care of by his daughter than by his daughter-in-law if he were to become bedridden and need care in the future. However, when we visit the in-laws' house for Christmas or during the summer holiday, Nancy seems to treat her father poorly. Even during meals, my father-in-law is treated as an outcast. When Mark or I try to eat with him, Nancy gets angry. "Dad likes to eat alone, so it's fine. Don't interfere." After meals, when I went to my father-in-law's room to talk, he expressed his dissatisfaction with Nancy. "I don't want to live in this house because Nancy gets in the way." According to my father-in-law, he always has meals separately from Nancy's family, and it seems that he gets less side dishes. Despite that, Nancy is still taking a decent amount of money for living expenses from her father, who is living on his pension. Nancy, who had said she would take care of her father, doesn't do his laundry, and it seems she doesn't do much housework in general. My father-in-law does most of the cleaning inside the house, and he takes care of all the gardening. Because Nancy disregards her father, even her husband and children, who live with them, don't treat my father-in-law with respect. It seems that when my father-in-law, who doesn't drive, asked Nancy's husband on his day off if he could drive him to the horse race track, he was treated as if he were being ridiculous. "I'm not your chauffeur. If you want to go to the races, use a taxi. If you have money to throw away on horse racing, contribute it to living expenses." He was bored, so my father-in-law said it was just a light-hearted comment, but he was strongly reprimanded. Nancy's 10-year-old son is cheeky and seems to tease my father-in-law. "Grandpa, stay away. You smell. Don't leave your room." Even though they've lived together since he was born, my father-in-law seems to have no memory of ever holding him. When my daughter visits, he dotes on her and talks with a hint of loneliness. "You're my only grandchild." Hearing such melancholic words, I started to feel sorry for my father-in-law. Every time we visit his house, my husband gets upset telling Nancy to treat their father better. In response, my sister-in-law retorts angrily at my husband, "I am treating Dad just fine. Are you trying to steal this house from me?" I won't let this house go to anyone. My husband says it's scary how obsessed my sister-in-law is with the house. And then, my father-in-law had a fall at home. The house is not equipped for the elderly, and he tripped over a small step, fracturing his right hand in the process. Thankfully, he had no other injuries and didn't need to be hospitalized, but it's hard to do anything without the use of his dominant hand. We went to visit him, and were shocked to see how frail he'd become. Not only is he unable to use his right hand, but he can barely move his feet and obviously needs care. However, my sister-in-law's family ignores him completely and does not take care of him. He can still make it to the bathroom on his own, but eating seems quite difficult. Immediately, my husband confronted my sister-in-law. "Why don't you look after Dad?" My sister-in-law seemed to not understand why my husband was angry and laughed it off. "A broken hand is no big deal, stop making a fuss. He can walk by himself and he isn't complaining." It seems that my father-in-law, being accustomed to being neglected, cannot stand up to my sister-in-law, and she probably knows it. My husband was even more furious and yelled at my sister-in-law. "Isn't it obvious we should take care of our parents?" Hearing my husband's words, my sister-in-law smirked and said, "The same goes for you, right, Mark? You look after Dad. I don't need an old man with barely any money, haha." I was enraged at how my sister-in-law could see her own father in such a way, but she continued to say, "Taking care of a father who only pays a small pension isn't worth it." Her words were so cruel that I lost my temper and spoke up. "Fine, we will take care of him. If he stays here, he won't heal properly." My husband seemed to agree, and we decided to take my father-in-law and move out of his house immediately. While we were packing up my father-in-law's belongings, my sister-in-law started making demands. "Just because you're taking care of Dad doesn't mean you get the house." My sister-in-law cares more about the house than her father and had nothing else to say. My husband responded dismissively, "Don't worry, I already bought a house, I don't need this one. Do whatever you want with it." My sister-in-law seemed relieved at hearing my husband's words. Even while we were preparing for my father-in-law's move, neither my sister-in-law nor her husband helped, but were keenly checking if there were any valuable items among his belongings. It seems they were benefiting from his pension, but with him gone, that would end. They were hoping to find something valuable they could convert into cash, but there were no treasures to be found. When my father-in-law left his house, neither my sister-in-law or her family bothered to see him off. They were so cold. My father-in-law, upon arriving at our house, seemed to lighten up as he happily played with my daughter. He seemed a completely different person compared to when he was living at his house. We let him live in a room that wasn't being used, but since the decision to move was sudden, we weren't able to make any preparations. If we had known earlier, we could have done some renovations, installed handrails, and removed any steps. Once the move was over and everything had settled, I apologized to my father-in-law. "Sorry, I wasn't quite prepared. I'll install the handrails and such later." To my surprise, my father-in-law seemed equally sorry. "My apologies, too, for making you worry. I wonder if $200 million will be enough to cover caring for me and to look after my horses." I couldn't help but laugh. I thought, is my father-in-law now making jokes like this since moving into our home and becoming more cheerful? "Horses, you say?" I laughed, knowing there was no way I could take seriously something as far-fetched as horses and $200 million. Deciding to play along with his joke, I replied, "I'm not sure how much it costs to take care of horses, but taking care of you will cost more." I had no idea why he brought up the horses, but I felt his joke was so over the top, typical of a wealthy person. Yet, seeing my father-in-law's worried face upon hearing my response, I began to worry if he found my joke funny. Then he started talking. "Does taking care of a person really cost that much? All I have left is $200 million. Staring at my father-in-law's serious face, I realized his earlier joke wasn't a joke at all. In a panic, I tried to explain. The previous comment was a joke. $200 million is more than enough. In fact, it's too much. I immediately sought my husband to ask about this horse business and the $200 million. My husband seemed just as clueless, but then he remembered something about his grandfather being a landowner. Do you remember me telling you my granddad was a wealthy man? Maybe dad was a horse owner. My husband and I went to ask my father-in-law for the whole story. It turned out that my father-in-law had owned horses for years, and his frequent trips to the racetrack were not to bet, but to check on his own horses. He had never told his family about owning horses, so my husband and his sister had no idea. Now, with his broken hand, he was beginning to seriously consider his future. He feared that if he mentioned owning horses and having $200 million in assets to his daughter and son-in-law, they would immediately demand it. My mention of making home modifications must have sparked his concern. He decided to confide in me about his horse ownership and his financial situation. Understanding the situation, my husband cheerfully reassured his father. I'm not sure how much it costs to take care of horses, but if you've got $200 million, you should be okay. We'll figure out your caregiving expenses, so just leave it to us. I was reassured by my husband's confident declaration. After confirming with the person who'd always looked after the horse that there would be no issues, we put the horse issue to rest. Now knowing that my father-in-law was quite a wealthy man, I began to see him in a slightly different light. I thought his daughter, who'd kicked him out despite his considerable assets, would regret it once she knew the truth. Imagining her regret brought a sense of satisfaction. Since my father-in-law moved in with us, our lives had changed. It was hectic managing my part-time job and caring for him, but my husband helped out, and we managed. With my father-in-law at home, my daughter found a new conversation partner, and he seemed even happier. His walking had improved since moving in, and even before the home modifications were finished, he was able to walk slowly with the help of a cane. Although his broken hand hadn't healed yet, he was practicing eating with his left hand. At his previous home, his nephew would complain every time he left his room, and he hadn't walked much. Whenever he tried to go to the racetrack, his son-in-law would look annoyed. This lack of activity may have led to his muscles weakening and him falling. On sunny days, he could even go for a walk with the help of my daughter. I'd been so focused on my father-in-law's recovery that I'd completely forgotten about my sister-in-law. However, 3 months after my father-in-law moved in with us, my sister-in-law called in a panic. "Is Dad there? If he's there, get him on the phone immediately." At that moment, my father-in-law was out for a walk with my husband and daughter, so when I told her that, she got even angrier. "You knew, didn't you? You knew that house was rented. That's why you took Dad, to cause problems for us." I didn't understand what she meant. She seemed to be saying their house was rented, but she'd always boasted that it was theirs. It might still be in my father-in-law's name, but calling it a rented house didn't make sense. As I was struggling to answer, my sister-in-law became even more heated. Some guy claiming to be the landlord of my family home showed up, saying I'm behind on rent and that I need to either pay up or get out. The confusion in my head only grew. When you mention the landlord of the in-laws' home, you'd think it's my father-in-law. Did he go to collect rent from my sister-in-law? Right then, my father-in-law returned, so I quickly explained the situation and had him answer my sister-in-law's call. Speaking with a hint of anger to the daughter that drove him out of his own home, my father-in-law said, "Weren't you informed that the house was rented? That house belongs to the company where my father was the CEO. I have been paying the rent until you kicked me out." My father-in-law sounded detached, and my sister-in-law, sensing his anger, shouted from the phone, "I haven't heard anything about this. I'm coming over right now, so wait for me." About 30 minutes later, my sister-in-law and her husband arrived, faces flushed red. They seemed surprised to see my father-in-law walking on his own, but clearly, there were bigger issues to address, as my sister-in-law erupted once more. "I thought the family home and land belonged to you, Dad. Did you deceive me?" My father-in-law responded, grinning at her. "I didn't deceive you. I just kept silent because you've been treating me so harshly." My sister-in-law was left speechless by his comment, so her husband stepped in. All that aside, can you please pay the overdue rent? If you don't, we'll be kicked out of the house. Despite the desperate plea of my brother-in-law, my father-in-law laughed it off. Why should I pay rent for a house where I'm not living? After you guys kicked me out, don't you think that's a bit too much to ask? Unable to retort to his reasonable statement, my brother-in-law fell silent. This time, my sister-in-law started to speak. Dad, were you planning to make us struggle from the beginning, pretending to be injured? You seem far more energetic than when you were living with us. Addressing my sister-in-law's bizarre claim, I stepped in. That's because he's been doing rehab exercises every day, practicing walking, and training to eat with his uninjured hand. My father-in-law added to my words, I think being kicked out by you guys was a blessing. Ever since I came to live with Mark, we all eat together, and I'm never treated like a nuisance. Upon hearing this, my sister-in-law and her husband clamped their jaws shut in silence. Then, right on cue, my daughter came and spilled the beans about my father-in-law's real status. Grandpa, your horse is going to race in the next horse race, right? My father-in-law grinned and answered her. It'll be in this Sunday's race, why don't we go watch it together? My daughter cheerfully ran off, but my sister-in-law and her husband seemed to catch the meaning of this, and hastily asked my father-in-law, Dad, do you own a horse? Are you a horse owner? My father-in-law replied, a smug look on his face, I kept silent because I figured if I told you about money, you'd take it. And talking about horse racing always gets your husband frowning. With that, the previously jovial face of my father-in-law turned stern. His intimidating expression sent chills down my spine, but as he slowly began to speak, the tension grew even more. I no longer consider someone like you who disrespects your own father as my daughter. I knew that you moved in with me for the inheritance. Caught off guard by the stern tone of my father-in-law, my sister-in-law was left visibly stunned. My father-in-law added the final blow, you won't get a single cent of my inheritance. Upon hearing these words, my sister-in-law seemed to be taken aback and staggered, her husband working hard to support her. Just like that, they both slumped their shoulders and left. The rent for my in-law's house was a hefty sum, and it was impossible for my sister-in-law and her husband to afford it, so they inevitably had to move out. I had no idea that my parents-in-law's house was rented, and my husband didn't know either. He later confirmed it with his father. After moving, my sister-in-law, who had been wasting money without a concern for rent, suddenly found themselves in a financial crunch. Their habit of splurging wasn't easy to shake off, and they were constantly using credit cards to make ends meet, which only led to growing debt. I was told that my sister-in-law and her husband, unable to rely on my father-in-law, moved to her husband's parents' house, but I don't know what happened after that. On the other hand, things have been smooth for us since we started living with my father-in-law. My father-in-law, who had broken his hand, healed well, and his legs and hips became stronger, to the point that he could do anything on his own. He's now so energetic that he goes jogging with my daughter. He's like a different person from when we first moved in. Ever since this incident, my father-in-law has been discussing various things with my husband and has been thinking about the future, even drafting a will. I don't know what's in the will, but I assume he's arranged things so that his daughter won't inherit anything. What made me happiest was that my father-in-law paid off the remaining balance of our home loan. We still had nearly 20 years of payments left, but I'm grateful that he paid it off ahead of schedule. With the loan fully paid, my father-in-law is considering doing some renovations to our home to make it more accessible, smiling as he talked about his plans. Once the renovation is finished, I can become bedridden any time. But I don't want him to say such things. I want him to stay healthy for as long as possible. My name is Caroline, and I'm 49 years old. I have been married to my husband, Carter, for 20 years now, and last year, when our son left home to go to college outside of the prefecture, I had more free time to spend. However, I still have to send him money for his expenses, so I decided to start working part-time. Since I've been a housewife since our son was born, I initially struggled with many aspects of the job. But lately, I've been feeling a sense of accomplishment as my opinions are being valued at work. Hey Carter, they said they might raise my hourly wage a bit. It feels good to be recognized for my hard work, I said with enthusiasm as I talked to Carter, who was watching TV absent-mindedly. And then, he suddenly asked, "So, does that mean you can live on your own now?" Suddenly, my husband asked something completely nonsensical. Huh? I responded, thinking it might be a misunderstanding due to his casual tone. He turned towards me and continued speaking, "It's perfect timing. I've been meaning to tell you." My husband's smirk gave me an uneasy feeling. "I've got myself a lovely girlfriend. You're no longer needed." His unexpected words left me stunned. "Get the divorce and marriage certificates from the city office tomorrow." He said it without a care in the world. It was so abrupt that I couldn't make sense of it. What do you mean?" I asked. He wanted a divorce because he had a girlfriend. He planned to remarry with new girlfriend. As the situation became clearer, I felt my body trembling. My husband chuckled at my reaction. "I can still live as a man, unlike you who's been avoiding me for ages. Besides, our physical relationship has been non-existent for a long time, so there's no point in being together anymore." His disrespectful remarks were infuriating. It's true that we haven't had a husband-wife relationship for a long time, but that doesn't mean I've given up on being a woman. In fact, I'd rather not be reminded of my 50-year-old, out-of-shape husband and his male desires. I felt a surge of anger and, inexplicably, burst into laughter. "You're tired, busy, and a hassle. All you ever say are those things, and you've been avoiding me. Wanting to live as a man now is just a joke." Suddenly, my husband's expression turned stern. "What's so funny? Don't mess around, old lady." He used rough and offensive language. Then he crossed his arms, slumped down, and said, "Off. You're so different from Ayla. She's head over heels in love with me. She's bragging that I'm the best boyfriend she's ever had. What about you, on the other hand? Erase. You're so happy about such a little thing, aren't you?" Carter seemed eager to boast about his mistress, Ayla, and looked down on me. "Gayla. That's her name. Gayla Ayla. She's not a snail." And then, Carter went on to proudly describe Ayla's background. "She's in her mid-20s, more than a decade younger than him. And she's pregnant with his child." Nowadays, age-difference marriages are not uncommon, but for a parent with an almost 20-year-old son to have a child with a woman who is not much older than his child, I felt like going crazy with disgust. "In life, you need love," he said. "Rather than being frozen and covered in mold like you need love that's as fresh as freshly made dough, just like Ayla's smooth and radiant skin. Otherwise, it's not worth spending money on." My husband, Carter, was talking rapidly with a rolled tongue. "Oh, so it's basically affection bought with money, huh? Ignoring his own aging, he's choosing a young and fresh girl. I see. You switched to a girl with no morals who's fine with cheating on a married man for money," I pointed out. When I pointed this out, my husband said, "It's not about money. I'm telling you it's about love." He spat at me and got angry. "Anyway, I'm serious. I need to marry Ayla as soon as possible to put my mind at ease. You should pack your bags and leave." Well, he certainly listed everything in his favor. I was speechless with astonishment. At the same time, I found it somewhat ridiculous. After all, how long had it been since this man used the word love with me? I'm sure that girl, Ayla, will stop showing any reaction after a while. Over time, along with aging, such fleeting emotions would surely fade away. Rather than that, the terrible words my husband is throwing at me now will be directed at a woman named Ayla next. Really, you're quite pathetic. I should have realized it before we got married. Come to think of it, I've been handling all the household chores and childcare by myself. Instead of lending a helping hand, my husband began to criticize me constantly, saying I haven't done this or that. Even though it was the era when such remarks were considered normal, there wasn't a single word of love or appreciation. And now, he's using me up, tossing me aside, and switching to a younger woman. I could hardly believe it was insane. But Carter seemed to take my words as a sore loser and said, "Well, then, there is no problem between us. Anyway, I'll fill out the form on my next day off." Just make sure you have both of them ready." He left me alone and went back to his room. For the next few days, I had sleepless nights, and my tears of regret wouldn't stop. Still, outwardly, I pretended to remain unfazed. On the next holiday, my husband had invited his affair partner to our house. "Hello there, Carter's old wife. I've come to help with the paper war." Sitting on the sofa with a humming tune, the woman named Dayla crossed her legs high. She had soft skin and confident appearance, clearly felt good about herself. Given her profession, her makeup was flashy, and her clothes were excessively revealing, with the design exposing her cleavage. Her tight skirt was so many that even I, as a woman, felt unsure where to look. But I felt that she didn't really love my husband. My intuition told me that her purpose was surely. I had already prepared myself for divorce, so I faced her. I didn't intend to resist, but her words and actions bothered me. "So, your name is Ayla, right? Did you start dating Carter knowing he's a married man? Calling me Carter's old wife means you both understand each other's positions, right?" She laughed and said, "I'm not dumb, you know. Don't underestimate me, old lady. You're the one who's about to be discarded. I'm going to be Carter's wife from now on. It's an easy deal, isn't it?" "I see. I'm glad you answered so clearly. I even recorded this conversation. So, you know that I can also claim alimony from you, right?" I showed them the recorder I was using to tape this conversation. She sighed with annoyance and complained to my husband, "Carter, I thought you said your wife wouldn't interfere. This isn't what we agreed on." My husband tried to calm her down, saying, "Don't worry. I've thought about it, right, Ayla? No need to get so angry." Carter, Ayla. Their conversation was truly cringeworthy. As I frowned, my husband brought out some documents. "Write the divorce papers with these conditions." The document listed conditions for divorce, including alimony and pension division. "What? You're giving this old lady $30 million. That'll reduce my share, won't it? Without me having to investigate further." She candidly exposed her farts. "It'll reduce," she repeated. I was sure of it. Her goal was my husband's inheritance, which he was currently in the process of inheriting from his real father. Well, Ayla, this includes our son's child support, you know." In his eyes, his wife's blatant reluctance even seemed cute as he tried to soothe her. "It's like a severance payment, huh? Expensive, isn't it?" I struggled to contain my peak of anger. Nevertheless, I was convinced that my intuition was right and added, "If the terms of the divorce can be documented in a notarized agreement, then this is fine. Also, I would like the payment to be made in one lump sum." I kept my response to the minimum, and Carter, aware that the conversation was being recorded, agreed to the terms. "Are you satisfied now?" During the exchange with my husband, that woman, who had been looking bored, urged us to finish filling out the divorce papers. "Old lady, you have to move out of here by the end of the month, okay? I'm going to cancel the lease at the place I'm living now. I'll leave once the notarized agreement is ready and the divorce papers are filed," I replied. Upon hearing this, the woman, who seemed ready to move in immediately, grumbled with dissatisfaction and reluctantly left. Eventually, the notarized agreement was finalized, and Carter and I were divorced. Then, as if she had been waiting, that woman came to kick me out. "Come on, hurry up, don't dawdle, get out," she said with glee. "He, ha, the cheerful woman continued. "I just filed the marriage certificate. Now I'm Carter's wife. This fabulous house is mine." I reluctantly handed her the keys to the front door as she was jumping with joy. At that time, I was curious, so I asked, "Isn't Carter about the same age as your parents? If you call me an old lady, then Carter, who is older than me, is an old man. Why did you choose such a person as your marriage partner?" Her blunt answer matched my expectations perfectly. "Carter is a division manager at a top tire company. This house is a recently renovated property near a station. It's a pretty stylish single-family home. I'll replace the furniture to my liking." She was daydreaming. "Carter treats me like a princess. He's not handsome and a bit old, but he says he'll buy me anything I want." She mocked me, looking triumphant as if to say her future was secured. "Hope everything goes as you wish." With a sigh, I left the house I had lived in for many years. I moved to a dormitory of a certain university. I was hired as a live-in dorm mother, which is very rare nowadays. Actually, I had been working part-time at a company cafeteria. When I explained to my employer that I wanted to make a fresh start after leaving Carter and start on my own in a different place, my boss, who appreciated my usual work ethic, contacted the head office. The dormitory position had just become available due to an employee's retirement, and I gratefully accepted it. I was really glad I had gotten my nutritionist certification. The rent and utilities were super cheap. Although I didn't have much free time to go out, it was a comfortable and enjoyable workplace. About 3 months into this new life, I received a call from my ex-husband. "Mom's in trouble. Can you help with her care?" he asked. Which nerve to say such a thing? We're strangers now. It's your wife's job to take care of her, I pointed out, stating the obvious. He responded, "Ayla is pregnant. Mom seems to have dementia and throws things, so it's dangerous. So, it's okay for her to throw things at me." What a logic. Absolutely not. Don't call me anymore. We're done. I firmly rejected him. I had been in touch with my mother-in-law for 20 years since my marriage, but we never had a close relationship. And now, just starting to live independently, I couldn't afford to care for someone else. But Carter somehow found out where I was and came to see me with that woman. It's hopeless. "If you can't provide care, then return the alimony you were paid," he said, making an absurd demand. "I don't think I have any obligation to comply with such a request," I replied coldly, pushing him away, only to be met with a fierce glare from that woman. "Old lady, you knew and tricked us. We were counting on an inheritance that turned out to be non-existent, and instead, we found a mountain of debt," she yelled, scattering papers everywhere. "Tricking you? That's a terrible thing to say. You just assumed Carter had wealth." I sighed deliberately. Indeed, when I was handling the inheritance procedures for my late father-in-law, I discovered he had a significant amount of debt. If that was all, just renouncing the inheritance would have been enough. However, Carter had cancelled his father's cell phone plan and sold off household items and jewelry for cash before the procedures. There's a law that if you handle any property before the inheritance renunciation procedures, you can't renounce it, and that's exactly what happened. As a result, the debt fell squarely on Carter and that woman. I triumphantly said, "Carter dumped the tedious inheritance procedures on me and didn't bother to ask anything about them. That's because, Ayla, he needed money to continue his affair with you and touched the estate for that very reason. That's something you should have clearly stated." Carter protested, "But that's exactly my line. You didn't ask when you should have. Now both of you have to take responsibility." "What? I didn't know about this. I wasn't told." She panicked, her face pale. "So, you plan to just take the money and run, huh?" They approached me aggressively, but that's not my problem. "You make such a silly point. If you hadn't cheated on me, you wouldn't have had to make money for your mistress, and you could have disinherited it. You definitely caused this situation." "Gah." He groaned and stepped back. "You knew he was married, Ayla, and still pursued a relationship for his assets, even going as far as to have a child and kick me out. You desired this situation and put yourself here." I lectured her, almost old enough to be her mother. If I knew it would come to this, I wouldn't want such an old man. But I still had something to say. "Do you remember the notarized agreement from our divorce? I received alimony, pension division, and child support from Carter. But I can also demand alimony from you." "What? You're saying $30,000 isn't enough? That's just greedy." She screamed in disbelief and hurled insults at me. "Well, I was going to forget about it if you guys would just leave me alone now that I'm no longer relevant. But you keep coming up with nonsensical theories, demanding that I take care of your mother, or return the alimony that you paid, and all sorts of other unreasonable things. I've lost my patience with you." When I revealed that I had recorded our divorce terms discussion and was serious about demanding alimony, she ran away without looking back. While watching her leave, I turned back to Carter, who was still standing there in shock. I wonder if someone in the late stages of pregnancy can run like that. Is she really pregnant? And where's the love after she just ran off? At my question, Carter gasped, "I was wrong. Please come back," he begged tearfully, suddenly looking much older. "Not a chance. Please leave." Kaoroli Inie. He cried out pitifully, but after everything he had done, I felt no sympathy. As I expected, that woman left the divorce papers and disappeared, apparently lying about the pregnancy. Carter now shoulders the debt and the care of his mother alone, worn down by stress and overwork. I find that taking care of children around the same age as my son as a dorm mother suits me well, and lately I've been getting compliments about looking younger. I plan to continue living honestly, without arrogance or foolish parts. Everyone, be careful when it comes to divorce. My name is Miller. I'm just a typical 25-year-old office worker, living alone away from my parents' house. Originally from the countryside, I moved to New York for work, and now I'm working as an accountant at a certain trading company. And I have a boyfriend of 1 year. His name is Johnson. He's 27. Johnson used to be a salesman at a trading company that occasionally visited my office. Initially, we would just exchange polite greetings, but we discovered we're from the same state, and from then on, we hit it off. He also moved to New York for work. Would you like to grab a meal sometime? Sure, let's go. I started getting invited out on dates. Would you mind giving me your number? Yes, of course. And so, we started going out. Then, on our first anniversary, he proposed. It seemed like the perfect timing. I liked Johnson, and I thought it would be nice to be together forever. There was no reason to decline. Yes, I replied, and Johnson began to tell me about his family background. Actually, my family runs a company. Is that so? So I plan to quit my current job and eventually return to the family business. It's called Johnson Paper. Ever heard of it? I do. It's a big company. Right. Everyone in the area knows about it. They even have TV commercials. I never expected that Johnson's family would own that Johnson Paper company. That company is well known, ranking in the top 10 companies in the state. The current president is the second generation, so could Johnson possibly be the third? Well, so Johnson, you're the heir. Well, something like that. Miller, you're lucky to have been chosen by me. His proud attitude made me smile awkwardly. Was Johnson always like this? And if he plans to return to the family business, why didn't he tell me before proposing? It was the first time I felt uneasy about Johnson. What would happen to my job if we got married? I had told Johnson that I wanted to gain experience as an accountant in a regular company and eventually help my father in the real estate business. Was he going to take all that into consideration? I wanted to ask, but I hesitated, thinking maybe Johnson had some plans. Since he didn't rush me to quit my job, returning back to his family home might still be far off. We could talk about it in the future. That's what I thought, but Johnson started changing little by little after that day. Or rather, his true colors gradually emerged. He began boasting about his family's wealth. I've never had to work hard for money. Employees at the company call me the young master and always treat me well. So Miller, you'll benefit from it too. Even though he said such things, I didn't feel happy at all. Rather, I started feeling disgusted by Johnson's bragging about his family's wealth. Why did you work at your current company before taking over the family business? That's obvious, isn't it? For the experience. Well, I got in there because of my old man's connections. Oh, by the way, I bought another car. Well, using my old man's, or rather, the company's money. Until now, Johnson never showed any signs of arrogance. But suddenly, it felt like he was a different person, his words piercing like thorns. I used to love Johnson for his humility and simplicity. Is it really okay to marry him? With no mention of taking over the company or returning to his hometown, my distrust only grew. But since I accepted his proposal, I couldn't bring myself to reconsider. About a month after accepting the proposal, I visited Johnson's parents. Their house was a 3-story mansion, truly befitting a prestigious family. Expensive artwork adorned the spacious garden, and colorful fish swam in the pond. One of these fish cost tens of thousands. This one even won a national award, Johnson boasted, but it didn't quite impress me. He owned 6 luxury cars like Benz and Ferrari, all bought with company money. Did he really need to mention that? But isn't there something odd about that? Doubts crept in. Inside, Johnson introduced me to his parents. What do your parents do, Miller? Johnson's mother immediately inquired. My father works in real estate, I replied. To which Johnson's father rudely remarked, "Not a respectable job." How disrespectful, especially for a first meeting. What's wrong with a job in real estate? Though infuriated, I couldn't afford to sour the atmosphere. Just go along with it. Just go along with it. Just smile and nod along. Well, can't be helped. Unlike us, they're just commoners. Exactly, Dad. It's rude to say something like that even to mere commoners. What are they even saying? I was speechless. Their elitist attitude, the idea that they can't talk to lower-class people. The lack of malice in their conversation was even scarier. They probably think this is normal. I felt like I stumbled into a different dimension, nausea rising in me. I couldn't possibly get along with this family. Those anxieties swirled in my mind. By the way, Miller, you work in accounting, right? Yes, that's correct. Well then, after the marriage, you can work for us, Johnson's father interjected. It's a personal request from the CEO. You're lucky, Miller, Johnson's mother added. We're counting on you, Miller. Before I could interject, the conversation kept going. Seeing Johnson happily chatting with his parents, I looked at him in despair. Wait a minute. I just wanted to say. Desperately trying to interject, but nobody seems to listen. With that, the conversation came to an end for the day. Alone with Johnson, I decided to confront the lingering questions about our future. When are you going back to your parents' house? As soon as we get married. So, Miller, you better start preparing too. Wait a second, I haven't agreed to anything. I mentioned going back to my parents' house, right? Well, yes, but I thought that was something we'd discuss later. And besides, I have no intention of quitting my job. The conversation wasn't going smoothly at all. Wait, why? You'd be happier working at our company, right? It's bigger than your current company. But I don't intend to quit my job right away. Even if you say that, working at our company would be more secure and easier than at that company, don't you think? I didn't like Johnson's attitude of thinking he could have everything his way and belittling my company. I started to lose interest in marrying him. Those feelings grew stronger and stronger. The day after I talked to Johnson about it, his mother called me personally. Miller, I heard that you don't want to be involved with our company. We can't accept someone like you as our daughter-in-law. But I don't want to quit my job right away. An accounting job is the same anywhere, isn't it? I was scolded by Johnson's mother in a harsh tone, and I felt intimidated. Anyway, come over here this week and explain it to the president properly. Got it. I felt overwhelmed as I hung up the phone. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get really messy. That weekend, when I visited Johnson's parents' house, they sat with their arms crossed, glaring at me. Johnson, are you sure? Is she really someone you want to marry? We don't need someone uncooperative like her in our family. Johnson's parents said whatever they wanted. When Johnson heard that, he came to me in tears, saying, Miller, please, quit your job and come live with me. But I couldn't bring myself to accept. I want to continue working at my current job. Please understand my position. But if you stay in New York, you can't live a married life together, can you? Well, that's true, but do you really want to get married? When asked again, I couldn't honestly say yes. Seeing my indecisive attitude, Johnson's parents had had enough. That's it. Leave now. I was finally kicked out of Johnson's house. For a while after that, I didn't hear from Johnson. I resigned myself to the idea that if the marriage couldn't happen, as long as things didn't get worse, it would be fine, and I felt a little relieved. Then, about 2 weeks later, Johnson called me with a serious tone. My parents want to meet. They want you to come over to our place this weekend with your parents. They want to talk about the future. I knew what it meant. It was over. Despite hesitating about marriage, I still loved Johnson. So when I heard those words, tears welled up in my eyes. I thought we could be happy together. Why did we have to have so many misunderstandings between us? What should I have done differently? No matter how much I asked myself, I couldn't find an answer. It was over. I resigned myself to that fact. I took some time off and went back to my parents' house. I had told my parents about the proposal, but I hadn't told them about what happened afterward. They had asked about the wedding date and meeting Johnson's parents, but I had been evasive with my answers. I felt like I had to tell them everything, so I did. Dad, Mom, I'm sorry for keeping quiet. I think the engagement is off. What? What happened? Why is it off? My parents were beyond shocked. I told them about Johnson's parents, his change in attitude, and how they treated me. My parents could sense my pain. They're selfish people. Absolutely. They showed understanding and hugged me. If it's going to be cancelled, it's better to discuss it together properly. Yay, it's good to know things before getting married. With my parents' words, the tension that had been building up until then suddenly dissipated, and large tears streamed down my cheeks. Miller, there are plenty of men out there. Don't worry about it. Encouraged by my mother, I managed to regain my spirits. For me, breaking off the engagement isn't so bad. Since I wasn't sure about marriage, it's actually the right decision. Thinking that way lightened my heart, but at the same time, anger toward the Johnson family surged within me. They had belittled us so much, I couldn't let them off the hook. And then, the day to visit his family arrived. Johnson's parents greeted me with disdain, as if looking down on commoners. They didn't even offer tea or asked us to sit down. Miller, all the talk about marriage, forget everything. Johnson started the conversation matter-of-factly, without a hint of remorse. As expected, I calmly handled the situation unfolding before me. I said nothing, just looked at Johnson. Then, his parents, egging him on, began openly discussing how unsuitable I was for the Johnson family, and how I wasn't fit for Johnson paper. Miller, someone like you who isn't willing to serve her husband. We come from a noble background, so honestly, your daughter isn't. My father, who had been quiet until then, suddenly interrupted them and erupted in anger like a raging fire. What do you mean? Please speak clearly instead of beating around the bush. Perhaps they didn't like his attitude, as their expressions instantly turned fierce. Can't you read between the lines without having us say it outright? You paupers, we won't accept a marriage with peasants from the countryside. How dare they say such rude things in public? I was beyond angry. I was disgusted. Even my parents sighed and exchanged glances. There was no point in saying anything further. I realized that. I see. Then we'll leave. Let's go, Miller. Yes. At my father's words, I stood up. As we were leaving, I left them with a parting shot. Johnson, I hope you won't regret this. Then, one day, about 2 weeks later, my parents received a call from Johnson's side. Johnson's father, in a panicked voice, interrogated my father. What does this mean? I'm not sure what you mean. You didn't want to have to deal with poor people, right? I will not be renewing the lease you have with us. What are you saying? A big company like Johnson Paper wouldn't want to be associated with a rural family like ours. It would be a shame to you. My father runs a real estate company. He has quite a wide range of businesses and many companies as clients. One of them is Johnson Paper. My father owns about 100 parking spaces for the employees of Johnson Paper's factory, as well as part of the factory grounds. If that contract were terminated, Johnson Paper's operations would come to a halt. The panic in Johnson's father's voice was understandable. Why hadn't Johnson's father remembered my father, who was his business partner? As a business owner, he was incompetent. To do this all of a sudden would be a problem. If this happens, the company won't survive. We're also a business. Since there's a possibility we won't be able to collect rent, we can't rent it out. What's going on? We've been paying the rent properly, haven't we? You'll understand eventually. Anyway, the deadline is at the end of the next 2 months. You have more than 2 months, so why don't you find a new place? Johnson's father was speechless at my father's well-organized response. I will never forgive you for insulting my daughter. With that, my father hung up the phone. A few days later, the Internal Revenue Service raided Johnson Paper and the president's home. There were suspicions of tax evasion, and turns out it was all illegal. While Johnson's family's fish and car were purchased with company money, all the assets were registered under the president's name, not the company's. He had been pocketing company profits without authorization. The charges included tax evasion, breach of trust, and embezzlement. Although he somehow avoided criminal charges, he ended up paying nearly $1 billion in back taxes, fines, and penalties. My family had carefully discussed how we would seek revenge against them. The fact that the land owned by my father, which was lent to Johnson Paper, was a crucial part of the plan. Johnson's talk about buying a car with company money had raised suspicions of tax evasion. We consulted with lawyers about canceling the and lease contract and reported the tax evasion allegations to the Internal Revenue Service. One could say it was a revenge plot devised by someone familiar with the company's accounting, namely, my father. It later became known that Johnson's father was rumored to be a lousy president. He had inherited the company from his grandfather but lacked both business talent and knowledge, running the company with a reckless management typical of a second-generation prodigal son. And he had caused a fatal scandal by committing tax evasion. The company's reputation plummeted, contracts were terminated, and there was a wave of resignations among employees, putting the business in dire straits. My father had anticipated this outcome and had terminated the contract early. Amidst the turmoil, I received a call from Johnson. I thought it would be an apology, but to my surprise, it was a request to reconcile. "Hey Miller, can't we start over?" "Huh? What are you talking about now? Come on please. My family's in serious trouble right now. Please help us out." What a joke. Why would you ask a poor person like me for help? I quit the company too, and if things continue like this, I might end up in dire straits. Can't you at least ask your dad to lend us the land? That would be impossible. My father isn't running a charity. I coldly rebuffed him. After that, while Johnson Paper managed to avoid bankruptcy, it was refused loans from banks, and it continued to struggle. Nevertheless, it's surprising how easily they fell from grace. It's clear as day how sloppy their management was and how they hadn't thought of any contingency plans for emergencies. A family that arrogantly looked down on others, considering themselves upper class because of their grandfather's legacy. I intend to see through to the end of their downfall. Since then, I completely cut off contact with Johnson. I didn't want to be depended on, and above all, I wanted to forget everything quickly. And now, I've started dating a new man I've met. He's kind and respects others well. There are plenty of men out there. I'm holding on to my mother's words. "Miller, would you consider going out with me with marriage in mind?" A delightful confession from him. I'm a bit wary of the word marriage. But he didn't say anything, and just hugged me. I want to live and find happiness with him from now on.